Imagine lying in bed on a freezing winter night. The house is completely quiet, and then from down the hall you hear it.
That rattling wet cough.
Yeah, exactly. Coming right from your child's bedroom. Today, I mean, you'd probably just roll over, mentally calculate if you have enough children's cough syrup in the medicine cabinet and try to go back to sleep.
Right, it's just a passing winter cold.
But if you heard that exact same sound in the year 1895, your blood would run completely cold because you wouldn't assume it was a simple cold. You assumed it was diphtheria.
Oh, absolute.
The disease was so feared, so devastatingly common, that it actually earned one of the most haunting nicknames in medical history. People called it the Strangling Angel of Children.
It's a terrifying name for a terrifying reality.
It really is. But what is truly wild about this forgotten disease isn't just the sheer terror it caused. It's that the desperate rush for a cure led directly to one of the most shocking medical disasters of 1901.
Right.
A disaster that secretly built the entire modern American regulatory state.
It really did. It fundamentally reshaped how we approach medicine in this country. The story of diphtheria is just incredibly layered. We're looking at a disease that completely terrorized parents.
Yeah.
Which was then met with this incredible moment of foreign scientific brilliance, followed almost immediately by a profound local tragedy.
And out of that tragedy, we get this invisible safety shield that protects every single one of us today, whenever we walk into a clinic or a pharmacy.
Exactly. But to understand the sheer scale of the relief when a treatment was finally found, we really first have to understand the terror of the disease itself.
Right. What are we dealing with here?
Well, we are talking about a bacterial infection. It's caused by Corynebacterium diphtheriae. And the way this bacteria attacks the human body is just, well, it's brutally efficient.
It doesn't just, invade and multiply like a normal infection, right?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
The bacteria itself sets up shop in the respiratory tract. And then it releases this highly potent toxin into the body.
Oh.
And this toxin goes to work systematically damaging the heart muscles and the nervous system. But the most terrifying physical symptom, the one that actually gave the disease its strangling angel nickname, was what happened right in the child's throat.
The pseudomembrane.
Yes. The infection causes a thick, leathery pseudomembrane to grow aggressively across the airway. It's essentially a tough web of dead tissue and bacteria.
So it literally suffocates them.
It does. It physically blocks the airway.
That is just a nightmare for any parent. And just to put the scale of this fear into perspective for you, even at its later peak in 1921, which is, long after the main events we're about to discuss, the United States recorded roughly 206,000 cases of diphtheria in a single year.
Which is a staggering number.
It's massive. And out of those cases, there were over 15,520 deaths. That is a case fatality rate of about 7.5%. And it overwhelmingly targeted the young.
Right. It would just sweep through schools and entire neighborhoods.
Leaving empty desks and grieving families everywhere.
Which means almost every community in the country intimately knew the cost of this disease. I mean, parents lived in a constant state of hypervigilance. There was this desperate, palpable need for anything that could even slow the strangling angel down.
And that first glimmer of hope, the first true lifesaver, it didn't actually come from America.
No, it didn't.
It came from Germany in the 1890s. A scientist named Emil von Behring, who was sharing credit with his colleagues, Kitasato and Roux, developed the diphtheria antitoxin.
And this was an absolute game changer. I mean, von Behring even won the very first Nobel Prize in medicine in 1901 for this specific discovery.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. Because understanding what an antitoxin is and how it differs from a vaccine is completely crucial to understanding the disaster that happens later.
Absolutely.
So an antitoxin isn't like a shield that prevents the bacterial invasion in the first place. It's more like a specialized strike force sent in after the fact to neutralize a deadly poison that is already circulating in the bloodstream.
I love that analogy, yes. And generating that strike force required a massive biological operation. This was passive immunity, not a preventative measure.
So how did they actually make it?
Well, scientists would inject the diphtheria toxin into large animals, very often horses. They do it in small, gradually increasing doses over time.
Right.
And the horse's immune system would recognize the toxin and start producing specific antibodies to fight it off.
Okay, so the horse is basically acting like an antibody factory.
Exactly. Once the horse had built up a massive supply of these antibodies, scientists would literally draw the horse's blood, separate out the clear serum that contained those vital antibodies, and then bottle it.
Wow.
So when a sick child was suffocating from diphtheria, doctors would inject that horse serum directly into the child. And if they administered it early enough, those borrowed antibodies would neutralize the diphtheria toxin, dissolve that terrifying membrane, and save the child's life.
Think about the emotional whiplash for parents in the late 1890s. I mean, you go from facing a disease with a horrific mortality rate, sitting next to a bed utterly helpless, watching your child struggle to breathe,
It's unimaginable.
to suddenly having this literal miracle cure arriving in glass vials from Europe. The relief must have been just intoxicating.
Oh, the demand was instantaneous and completely overwhelming. American health departments saw the miraculous success of von Behring's antitoxin and realized very quickly that they couldn't just rely on importing small batches from Germany.
Yeah, the logistics of shipping across the Atlantic back then meant it was way too slow.
Too slow and far too expensive. They needed it right then, in their own cities, accessible to their own doctors.
So what did they do?
Well, local municipalities and private entrepreneurs just rushed to produce it themselves. Every major city started setting up their own stables, buying their own horses, and churning out serum to meet the local demand.
So every city basically decides to become its own pharmaceutical manufacturer overnight.
Pretty much.
But making a complex biological product isn't like, assembling a chair or weaving a shirt. It involves living animals, circulating blood, and microscopic pathogens.
And that is exactly what local health officials in St. Louis tragically underestimated in the autumn of 1901.
Okay, set the scene for us. What happened in St. Louis?
Well, the local health department was producing their own antitoxin to supply city doctors. And they had a specific horse they relied on, a horse named Jim.
Jim the horse.
Right. Jim had been a steady, reliable producer of diphtheria antitoxin for quite a while. But somewhere along the line, Jim contracted tetanus.
Oh, no.
Yeah. Tetanus is another horrific, soil-borne bacterial infection. People commonly know it as lockjaw. And it produces its own lethal toxin.
And here is where the sequence of events becomes an absolute nightmare. They drew blood from Jim to harvest the diphtheria antitoxin. But because he was infected with tetanus, his blood was now heavily carrying the lethal tetanus toxin.
Yes.
And that contaminated serum was processed, bottled, and sent out to local St. Louis doctors.
Those doctors, who were completely unaware of the contamination, administered that serum to children suffering from diphtheria.
And the result?
13 children died. And the really devastating part is they didn't die from the strangling angel. They died from tetanus, introduced directly into their bloodstreams by the very medicine that their parents had desperately sought out to save them.
Wait, I'm struggling to understand this. By 1901, Pasteur's germ theory was already widely accepted, right?
It was, yes.
We knew about basic sterilization, so how could a municipal health department just bleed a sick horse, put that blood into a vial, and inject it into children without anyone sounding the alarm? Was there absolutely no safety check?
What's fascinating here is that the science of microbiology and immunology had just sprinted so far ahead of the practical infrastructure. The regulatory guardrails hadn't even been conceptualized yet.
So it was just the Wild West?
Basically. And to answer your question about how this happened despite knowing about germ theory, tetanus has an incubation period.
Oh, I see.
When health officials drew Jim's blood, he wasn't showing severe symptoms yet. He appeared relatively healthy. He only developed the unmistakable terminal signs of tetanus days later and was subsequently put down.
But by then, the serum was already out there.
Exactly. Because there were no standardized mandatory protocols requiring them to hold and test the serum on lab mice before releasing it to the public, the lethal batches had already been distributed.
Wow.
There was no mandatory secondary testing. There was no federal oversight agency to mandate a recall. It was entirely up to the discretion of local stable managers and city health clerks.
The emotional toll of that specific failure is just staggering to think about. Those parents in St. Louis experienced the ultimate betrayal.
They really did.
They felt the overwhelming relief of finally securing the miracle antitoxin. They thought they had beaten the odds, only to endure the absolute nightmare of watching their children suffer and die from a completely different, equally agonizing disease, entirely because of human error.
You shattered public trust overnight. Suddenly, this miracle cure was viewed as a potential poison.
Which is completely understandable.
And to make matters worse, St. Louis was not an isolated incident. Right around the exact same time, in the fall of 1901, a parallel disaster unfolded in Camden, New Jersey.
Right, this smallpox outbreak.
Yes, an outbreak of smallpox led to a massive local vaccination campaign. But the smallpox vaccine, which at the time was derived from calf lymph, was also contaminated with tetanus.
Unbelievable.
Almost 100 cases of tetanus broke out in Camden, and several children died.
So you have two massive, highly publicized tragedies involving contaminated biological medicines hitting the public consciousness at exactly the same time in different parts of the country. The entire concept of biological medicine was suddenly on trial.
The public outcry was deafening. The federal government, which historically had stayed completely out of local medical and public health issues, viewing them as strictly state or municipal responsibilities, could no longer ignore the situation.
They had to step in.
They had to. The sheer, undeniable horror of 13 children dying in St. Louis from a contaminated diphtheria treatment, combined with those Camden smallpox deaths, forced Congress's hand. They had to intervene to save the credibility of modern medicine itself.
Which brings us to the birth of the modern safety net we all implicitly rely on today. On July 1st, 1902, President Theodore Roosevelt signed the Biologics Control Act.
Also widely known as the virus toxin law.
Right. And this law is a monumental tectonic pivot in American history. It was the very first federal regulation of biological medicines in the United States.
It dictated that you could no longer just set up a horse in a dirty stable, draw blood, and sell it as medicine.
Thank goodness.
Anyone manufacturing vaccines or antitoxins for interstate commerce now had to be officially licensed. And to keep that license, they had to submit to federal inspections.
So what does this all actually mean in practice? Let me try this analogy out on you. It's almost like Europe invented the automobile, but America responded to the inevitable horrific car crashes by inventing traffic lights, speed limits, and seatbelt laws.
That's a great way to look at it.
The lasting legacy of this era wasn't just the invention of the biological medicine itself, but the bureaucratic structural guarantee that taking it wouldn't kill you.
Yes, and to build on that seatbelt analogy, the government needed a dedicated police force to enforce those traffic laws. The breakthrough science, the antitoxin itself, was a foreign import. But the durable power that was created in response to the St. Louis disaster was a uniquely American regulatory apparatus.
Right, it changed the structure of a government.
Completely. The Biologics Control Act handed this unprecedented inspection and licensing authority to the Public Health Service. And more specifically, they gave this power to a small division called the Hygienic Laboratory.
And this is where the bureaucratic history actually becomes really fascinating, because the Hygienic Laboratory wasn't just some dead-end government office that faded away.
Far from it. That exact laboratory, empowered by the 1902 Act to send inspectors into pharmaceutical plants, to demand sterile environments, and to randomly test vials of serum for purity, grew rapidly. Over the decades, the Hygienic Laboratory evolved directly into the National Institutes of Health, the NIH.
Wow.
Furthermore, the core regulatory authority established by that 1902 law, the legal mechanism to mandate safety and pull dangerous drugs off the market, later flowed into what we now know as the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA.
So the fundamental DNA of the FDA and the NIH, the very systems that test every single medicine we take today, is directly linked back to the tragedy of those 13 children in St. Louis and a horse named Jim.
Exactly. This quiet structural authority, the power to inspect, to license, and to ensure purity, became the signature lasting power of the Public Health Service.
It's incredible how that worked out.
It wasn't glamorous work at all. It was scientists in lab coats checking records, swabbing stable floors, and testing animal serum.
Yeah.
But it was permanent. It built the foundation of the modern regulatory state, shifting the power from local municipalities making educated guesses to a standardized federal baseline of safety.
But the story of our fight against diphtheria doesn't end just by making the antitoxins safe. Because as we established earlier, an antitoxin is only a treatment.
Right.
It's the strike force you send in after the poison is already circulating in the child's body. And even with strict federal oversight ensuring the serum was clean, it was still a reactive measure.
True.
To truly banish the strangling angel from American life, science had to evolve from treating the disease to preventing the infection entirely.
The medical community knew they had to find a way to stop the bacteria from taking hold in the first place. And the first major step toward that came in 1913, when a scientist named Bela Schick introduced the Schick test.
Oh, I've heard of that. What exactly did it do?
It was a relatively simple skin test that allowed doctors to determine if a person was susceptible to diphtheria, or if they had already developed a natural immunity through a mild, perhaps unnoticed previous exposure.
Which is incredibly useful for mapping out an outbreak and knowing exactly who is in actual danger. But the true, definitive conquest of the disease arrives in the 1920s. That is when researchers successfully developed the diphtheria toxoid.
And the toxoid represents a fundamental leap forward in immunology. It is totally different from the antitoxin.
Because the antitoxin was passive, right?
Remember, the antitoxin was passive immunity, borrowed antibodies from a horse. The toxoid, on the other hand, provides active immunization.
So it's actually preventive.
Yes. Scientists discovered how to take the lethal diphtheria toxin and treat it, usually with heat or chemicals like formaldehyde. This inactivation process fundamentally alters the toxin so it can no longer harm the human body.
Okay.
But, and this is the genius of it, the inactivated toxin still looks enough like the original threat that it triggers the human immune system.
It essentially hands the immune system a mugshot of the enemy. The body sees this harmless toxoid, recognizes it as foreign, and trains itself to produce its own antibodies.
That's exactly how it works.
It's completely preventative. You get the toxoid before you ever encounter the live bacteria, and your body is already armed, trained, and ready to fight it off instantly.
And because it was safe and highly effective, the toxoid began rolling out across the country. Eventually, by the 1940s, this diphtheria toxoid was combined with preventive protections against tetanus and pertussis.
Pertussis being whooping cough, right?
Correct. And together they created the routine DTP shot. That single routine immunization became a standard part of childhood health care, and it is what finally drove the disease toward near disappearance in the United States.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. We have this clear historical trajectory. We move from the sheer terror of the disease to a flawed miracle treatment, to the strict bureaucratic laws passed in 1902 to regulate it, and finally to the preventative toxoid in the 1920s. But during that transitional period in the 1920s, the timeline overlaps in a really dramatic way. While major urban centers were starting to roll out the modern preventive toxoid, rural America was still desperately relying on the old 19th century antitoxin treatment.
Yes, there was a huge gap.
And getting that safe, regulated antitoxin to remote areas remained a literal life-or-death struggle against the clock.
And the ultimate example of that geographical divide happened in 1925 during the famous Nome serum run.
Exactly. Even as the new toxoid was being celebrated in cities like New York and Chicago, a devastating outbreak of diphtheria struck the remote, snowbound town of Nome, Alaska.
It was a dire situation.
The local doctor diagnosed the disease, realized he didn't have anywhere near enough antitoxin to save the children, and sent out a desperate telegram. But the town was completely cut off by winter ice.
Right. Ships couldn't get through the frozen sea.
And the open cockpit airplanes of the era couldn't fly in the minus 50-degree blizzard conditions.
So they needed the antitoxin treatment immediately, but they had no modern way to get it there. It set the stage for one of the most iconic and cinematic moments in medical history.
The dog sleds.
Yes. To cover the 674 miles from the nearest train station to Nome, officials organized a relay of 20 dog sled teams, featuring incredible mushers and legendary lead dogs like Balto and Togo.
I remember reading about Balto as a kid.
Most of us do. They raced across brutal, jagged sea ice and whiteout conditions, passing this 20-pound cylinder of federal-regulated antitoxin from sled to sled until it finally reached the town.
It perfectly illustrates the stakes of the era. I mean, we talk about these dense bureaucratic laws passed in 1902 that mandate clean laboratories and precise licensing. But behind all those dry regulatory abstractions, there were real communities.
Absolutely.
Whether in St. Louis or the frozen Alaskan tundra, people were desperately waiting for this medicine. The 1902 Act ensured the serum inside that cylinder heading to Nome was pure and safe. But it still took a staggering, heroic human effort to actually deliver it to the people suffocating from the disease.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Nome serum run is the physical embodiment of everything public health strives to achieve. It reminds us that laboratory science and federal legislation are really only the first steps.
Right.
The ultimate goal is getting safe, effective, life-saving science into the bodies of vulnerable people before time runs out. The methods obviously evolved, from a dog sled in Alaska to refrigerated trucks and licensed manufacturing plants today. But the core mission remains exactly the same.
It really brings this entire historical journey into sharp focus. We started with a disease so brutal and suffocating it was universally feared as the Strangling Angel.
Yeah.
We saw the desperate hope brought by foreign scientific breakthrough, the antitoxin, and the logistical nightmare of trying to mass produce it locally. And we witnessed the devastating heartbreak of the 1901 St. Louis disaster, where 13 families lost their children to tetanus because the serum drawn from Jim the horse was contaminated.
And crucially, we traced how that specific local tragedy alongside the Camden smallpox disaster, fundamentally forced the federal government to abandon its hands-off approach.
It changed everything.
It led directly to the 1902 Biologics Control Act, establishing the rigorous licensing and inspection powers of the Hygienic laboratory and permanently planting the seeds for the NIH and the FDA. The science of the cure came from abroad, but the durable, protective infrastructure of regulation was built right here in response to a tragedy.
It's an incredible arc from pure terror to devastating human error to a quiet, bureaucratic triumph that literally changed the world and nearly erased the disease.
It is. And every single time you walk into a pharmacy or a clinic today and you confidently roll up your sleeve for a preventive shot, you're relying on an invisible, immensely complex web of safety.
You really are.
You trust that the vial is sterile, that the dosage is exact, and that the contents will protect you rather than harm you. It makes you wonder, how many of the everyday invisible safety systems we completely take for granted today were written in the immediate aftermath of forgotten historical tragedies?
Wow, yeah. It's a powerful thought to leave on, and it brings us right back to where we started. The next time you hear a child cough from down the hall, and your first thought is simply to grab a glass of water rather than bracing yourself for the strangling angel, well, you have an entire legacy of brilliant scientists, uncompromising regulators, and tragically lost children to thank for that peace of mind. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sources. Keep questioning the history behind the world you live in.